Hi, and welcome to Season 3, Episode 9 of My Words, Our Journey, What If? My name is Monty, and today we begin with Chapter 25. Days became weeks, and weeks ran into months. Luke came to visit almost every day. The two men had become very close over time. He was the only person in the world who seemed to believe in him anymore, and that was iffy. The day of his capture, Luke tried to gracefully back out of the situation, telling Mitch all the reasons he could not represent him. And he had many excellent reasons. From that first meeting, and for several months after, while performing all his attorney duties, he continued to protest his lack of experience and skill. He was worried about being responsible for another man's life. Luke had always wondered what it would be like to handle a high-profile case like the one he would see on TV or the news. The majority of them seemed to be so confident and sure of themselves, craving the spotlight and eager to talk about the battle they were about to undertake or had just completed. He had decided long ago, in a death penalty case, it took a special kind of person to be either a district or a defense attorney. Neither got much sleep, he was sure. Now he found himself right in the middle of what he always wondered about. He had given up on asking Mitch to consider other counsel. Each time he brought it up, in the past, he received the same response. You're the only person I trust in the world, and no matter how this turns out, I know you'll do your best. How could Luke argue with that? Still, he had moments of doubt. Only moments. The majority of the time, he believed Mitch, for two main reasons, really. Luke thought to himself, and considered himself a good judge of character. And more importantly, he had been over Mitch's story with him a minimum of at least 100 times, and he could find no inconsistencies. As crazy as his story was, it was crazy every time. Not once did he get confused or rattled, and he even passed a lie detector test, twice. Luke had decided he would lose sleep if he didn't fight for Mitch. He was his only hope. Chapter 26. The day of his trial had finally come. Now he would see just how well the justice system worked. An innocent man could be sentenced to death in the next few months if it did not work. Mitch understood that, and he knew his legal team knew it as well. There was a nervous energy. There had only been one occasion when Mitch had actually seen the inside of a courtroom. A few years back, Bridget had been driving while they were on their way to the movies. They were hit while crossing an intersection. All he really could remember was it was a long day with not much action or excitement, and once it was their turn, the whole thing took less than 10 minutes. The defendant pled guilty, and the judge gave him community service or something like that, and maybe driving school as his punishment for wrecking Bridget's new car. And if he remembered correctly, he was still $700 poor when it was all said and done. There was not much Mitch knew for certain anymore. He could be fairly certain today would be nothing like the day in traffic court. The good old days were gone forever, weren't they? For the briefest moment, a smile crossed his face. The good old days, right? Luke had done a good job preparing him for what would happen today. It was the day Mitch would first see how Luke and his team could handle themselves in court. According to Jim Hansen, one of Luke's young guns, jury selection is considered by many to be the most important part of a trial. Mitch sat quietly as the first round of potential jurors entered the room. There were only a few people in the world who truly knew Mitch was innocent, and with the evidence against him, he was not sure that his team of attorneys could convince even one member of a jury. He had decided at some point during this whole ordeal it was in a higher power's hands. If he was meant to have a life again, it would not be because of his or his lawyer's doing. In some ways, it had given him comfort over the long months, and his faith had grown. He had not found religion while in prison like many of the inmates. No, he had spent many a Sunday in church. It was amazing to him, though, how many of the others he met while incarcerated wanted to talk about the afterlife. It was even more interesting to Mitch what a high percentage of them believed they were going to a better place once they left this world. When the distractions of the world are taken away, and a man has an endless amount of alone time, his mind wanders. It wanders, and it wonders. After all the what-ifs are behind him, he starts to contemplate the afterlife, because for many, it's all they have to look forward to. Distracted for a moment, Mitch was snapped back to reality by a noise somewhere in the room. Should he look at them each directly? Would eye contact help them make a connection with him? Should he look down and distant, like he could not believe this was happening to him? They had discussed this earlier, but for the life of him, literally, he could not focus on what he was supposed to do next. Giving in, Mitch just decided to smile and nod as each person entered the room. In the end, he felt good about his decision. The process was even more exhausting than anyone could have prepared him. Each side jockeyed for position, asking probing questions that had been supplied by their very expensive jury experts. Questions ranged from, how do you feel about marriage? To have you already set an opinion on this case? With each hour that passed, the selection inched closer at a snail's pace, until just before 6 p.m. there was a jury set and alternates in place. The trial would begin in just 4 days. As far as he could tell, Mitch thought both sides appeared happy with the selection. How could that be? With his inexperienced eye, he thought it could have gone better. There had been more than one potential juror he was disappointed in not seeing move on in the process. We could not have asked for a better turnout, Luke softly spoke as they headed towards the back of the courtroom. I know we didn't win them all, but overall, I feel we did well with the final result. He looked over at his tired client. Please get some rest over the next few days. I need you looking and feeling your best. With a pat on the shoulder, I'm not going to lie to you. This is going to take its toll on all of us. We will need to feed off each other's energy. It may not be fair, Mitch, but we will be judged in part on how we appear to handle each new nuance of the trial. And we both know we need an advantage, large or small, every one we can get. Until right now, Mitch had not noticed how totally wore down his attorney looked. Without saying a word, he grabbed Luke by the elbow, turned him back towards the courtroom. It only took Luke a second to realize where Mitch wanted him to look. Lucy had not moved from her third row seat. She was waiting for individuals on either side of the aisle to move. I promise I'll do my best to get rest and ready. Only if you'll do the same. Go spend some quality time with your wife, will ya? One of us should be enjoying the company of a beautiful woman. And with a slight push, Luke was headed to do exactly that. Mitch, on the other hand, turned to be escorted out by 2 burly guards. Monday morning had just arrived in time. Both men felt they would have had to wait any longer. Their heads were going to explode. Mitch had spent much of his time reading. The rest was spent thinking about his life. Not so much where he had been, but rather where he was going. It felt good to think about life after all this. In his mind, he'd be found innocent, no matter the evidence. In fact, he was innocent of everything except trying to be a loyal friend and being a complete idiot. Where would his life take him? A new start? Didn't sound half bad. Maybe a new career? Would he move? Could he stay? Where would he go? Maybe somewhere south. He'd always heard Georgia was nice. Luke, on the other hand, was not worried so much about his future. It was the future of his client that occupied much of his time. Lucy had done a good job of distracting him for the most part, but there were several times when he just could not get the trial off his mind. He did, in fact, have a man's life and death to think about. He did wonder a little bit about his future. The trial could go either way, and he knew that. But how would the handling of it and the outcome be good or bad? How would it affect his practice? Why couldn't Mitch have just talked Aaron out of his crazy idea? As Luke entered the courtroom with the rest of his team, it almost took his air completely out of his lungs. He had been in numerous courtrooms, countless times. But the stillness in the air, the sense of life and death filled the room. At first, he thought maybe it was just his imagination. But as he looked around the room and found first the face of his loving wife, and then the expression shown by the opposing counsel, he knew it was just not his feeling, but that of the room. Mitch was brought in through the same side door he had been escorted through each and every time. He was accompanied by the same 2 guards, but this time Mitch appeared different, a different stride, a certain calm. He was in fact working very hard to pull it off. A new suit and all the compliments can only take a man so far. After that, he's on his own. Well, before he put on his new duds, he had decided to make a conscious effort to appear more confident in front of the jurors and the accusers. Have you been taking self-confidence courses behind my back? Luke whispered as Mitch sat down next to him. I feel pretty. I feel pretty. Smiling from ear to ear, Mitch replied. Well, you look great. Not sure I'd say pretty, but great. No more smiling until this is over, though, all right? And the day began, a day that Mitch would never forget. The day he heard out loud, and in front of a packed courtroom, the monstrosities he had been accused of committing. The opening statement was handled by a young attorney named Monica Stilwell. She could be described as easy on the eyes and having a voice and the way about her that would make any woman envious. Mitch could see why she was there. As he dared to steal a glance around the room, men and women alike were drawn to her every word. She just had that ability, even though with each word that came out of her mouth, she was telling the room what an evil and conspiring demon Mitch was. It was more difficult than he thought it would be to listen to. With each passing hour, Miss Stillwell told a tale. She had assured the jury that over the next several weeks, her colleagues and herself would show them just how Mitch, better known as the defendant, had planned and executed to deceive, steal, and murder. Murder not one, but 3 lovely individuals, whose time was taken too soon. We have no doubt you will find, as we have, that the defendant, Mitch Lipton, is not, nor was he the man he appeared to be to all that knew him. We are confident each of you will come to the realization what a true monster Mitch Lipton is. We only ask that you listen closely to all the evidence presented to you, and there will be a lot, but also listen closely to what the defense is going to try to give you as proof of his innocence. It may be hard to listen to with a straight face. I'm just warning you now. Thank you for your kind attention. Monica turned from the jury, and Mitch could see her face for the first time in minutes. She looked more than confident in her opening and herself. After a short break, it was time for Luke and his team to go to work. Tyler Brands would be the first to introduce himself to the jury and speak on behalf of Mitch. It had been a shock to Mitch at first when he had heard from Luke that Tyler was the choice to handle the opening statement. Luke was good at his job, and he had been ready for Mitch's concerns. After explaining to him who the prosecution would most likely be opening with, and after telling him how Taylor was easily the closest counter to Miss Stillwell, and finally after explaining to him how it was a group effort in preparing the opening statement, after all that explaining, Mitch was somewhat put at ease. Today, as he watched with extra attention, Mitch could not believe how well this young man was handling himself in front of this crowd on this important stage. You would never have guessed it was his first time, but it was. Tyler Brands matched his counterpart with a similar charisma and personality. Not only did he have the looks, Tyler also had the it factor. Women and men alike were drawn to him as well. That is what Luke was hoping for. He could only have chosen any member of his team to start off today, but Tyler would match up best with the prosecution. Luke loved his sports. When he had time to follow his favorite teams, lately that meant a quick check of the sports page and maybe even a glance on the internet. In sports, he had seen over and over that matchups could win or lose a game. If you could match up well in several areas, but did not have the overall best players, you could still win. The Detroit Pistons in the late 80s and early 90s were proof of that. Tyler did not try to discredit Monica. After a short discussion, everyone agreed that would not have been a smart approach. They knew going in there was an enormous amount of circumstantial evidence against their client. The best they could hope to accomplish in the opening was to begin to build the blocks needed to, in the end, cause as many members of the jury as possible to have reasonable doubt at the end of the day. And Tyler was well on his way. Again, ladies and gentlemen, I ask that you really listen to what I just stated as fact. The defendant, Mr. Lipton, volunteered to take a lie detector test and passed with flying colors. He even chose to have opposing counsel use the expert of their choice. And as you will see in his report later in the process, there can be no doubt Mitch was, and is still today, telling the truth. Mitch is not an evil monster. Instead, he was too good of a friend, who could not talk his best friend out of a scheme many would find foolish. I ask you to remember, as you hear testimony, Mitch does not have to prove his innocence. Rather, the prosecution has to prove his guilt. Thank you for your attention and time today. Tyler nodded to the jury, made eye contact through a long, slow sweep with each member. He felt good. There had been times when he had in fact doubted his client's innocence, but that had been early in the process. Today, as it had been for months, Tyler knew he was defending a man caught up in a bad situation. He tried not to look smug as he walked back to his chair. In his mind, he knew he had nailed the opening. Whatever happened from this point forward, he knew he had done his part for the team. He had set the stage. Now, the rest of his team would have to step up and reach the bar he had just set. Was it bad for him to have these thoughts, after just standing in front of a room full of strangers and sounding so thoughtful and caring? Nah, he was just a little pumped up. He knew it was a complete team effort, and they had done his share of the prep and writing of the speech he had just given. He would also do his part in contributing to the remainder of the case. It was going to take a superhuman effort by each member if they were going to have a chance to save an innocent man. The day had begun with talk of what a completely vile and disgusting creature Mitch was, and it ended with him seeming a little more human. Maybe no one had been convinced he was not guilty, but as Mitch looked around the room at the end of the first day, he thought the way many of the jurors looked at him had changed. Was it for the good? He thought so. That night he slept well. Mitch had his last thought about 9 o'clock and slept straight through until he heard the guards coming to tell him he had 30 minutes until he had to leave. He had no idea how the day would play out, and what he did know was today the prosecution would start parading their so-called experts in front of the jury. The barrage began with an expert named Roswell Matterson, who had made a living in the courtroom, testifying on behalf of prosecutors. His expertise? It depended on the case and what the people paying his fee required. Today, he would be answering questions on the psyche of a murderer. Sidney Fortmeyer was the lead prosecutor, and he did not lose, ever. It was not important to him who the star turned out to be during the trial. What did matter to him, more than anything in life, was winning, and luckily for him, he was good at what he did. Today, Sidney would be handling Roswell. They had spent many times together, in and outside of the courtroom. It had taken a while, but he had turned the man sitting before him today into a highly desirable expert witness. The ride had been a bumpy one, with many screaming matches along the way, but over time, they had learned to work together. It had helped Sidney win several close cases over the years, and it made Roswell one of the highest paid experts in the state of Virginia over the last several years. What makes you qualified to testify today before this court on the topic of criminal mind, Dr. Matherson? Sidney asked without even looking in the direction of his witness. Instead, Sidney preferred to give all his attention to the jury. It would almost appear to someone outside of his team that he would sometimes ignore the witness. In reality, of course, that wasn't the case. But it was true. No one knew the importance of connecting with each and every jury member more than the man standing before them this particular morning. Mitch had not paid much attention to the witness's answer. He had already been told all about him. Some high-priced school where he graduated with several fancy-sounding degrees, a stint teaching a high-priced private college, and several highly respected articles written in highly respected journals. Can you tell the jury what your first impression was after reading the accounts of the case, both from the police report and also from handwritten statements by witnesses and the defendant himself? It really isn't that simple. You have to look at the background, surroundings, associations, and tendencies of a man or woman in each individual case. Take, for example, Mr. Lipton's job. He works in an accounting firm, a firm where his coworkers admitted Mitch had a lot of downtime. It has been proven individuals that have too much time on their hands are 76% more likely to commit a premeditated crime. That is only one of many factors that could lead to one's downfall. Another is alcohol. Alcohol is proven, in study after study, to contribute to one's thought processes, one's overall views of life and marriage. Sidney Fortmeyer turned away from the jury and started to walk towards Mitch's table at a slow pace. Mr. Matherson, do we know if the defendant is a drinker? Why, yes, we do. It did not take long into the interviewing process to see a pattern begin to form. Almost every person we interviewed, from coworkers to neighbors, had one thing in common. They each mentioned his habit of drinking beer. Mitch could not believe what he was hearing. Was that the angle they were taking, portraying him as an unhappy alcoholic? There was even at least one night of the week that was totally devoted to drinking, smoking, and otherwise hanging out at bars. Anyone who knew him would be able to testify in defense of Mitch's character, and he wrote as much on his legal pad and moved into Luke's line of sight. In large letters, Luke wrote back, "Do you go to the bar every week? Did you ever walk outside of your home with a beer? Do you drink occasionally at a neighbor's functions? Do you have a drink if you and Bridget went out to dinner?" These are the questions the prosecution would ask during cross-examination. Don't worry, Mitch. There is a large percentage of our society that would answer yes to many of those questions, he wrote down. Luke whispered and smiled as his friend and client. The rest of the day was a blur to Mitch. He was finding it very hard to concentrate. A man could only sit and be quiet bystander for so long before his mind would start to wander. If he was just a casual observer, he would have thought Roswell Matherson had done a good job of discussing his points before the jury. There was only one problem. The person he was describing was not real. Mitch had not sat around at work scheming to rob a bank because he was envious of his neighbor's big truck or bigger house. He was not unhappy in his marriage or his life, and therefore causing him to drink too much. He did not avoid having a family because he was the type of man who didn't want to look forward to responsibilities. He was not the man that the prosecution walked the so-called expert through the motions of describing. No, he was none of those things, or any of the other disturbing descriptions used to build an impression with the jury of what Mitch was or what he was thinking in the months leading up to the horrendous crimes. It was harder than he imagined sitting by and listening to the false statements and accusations, much harder. Over the next few weeks, the prosecution brought before the court several witnesses to prove their case. 3 witnesses from the bank testified Mitch and Aaron were the 2 men who had entered the bank, robbed, and killed one on that dreadful day. Each spoke with the utmost confidence and wavered not in the least during cross-examination. The best the defense could do was get each to acknowledge it was chaotic and frantic within the bank, and people were scared for their lives. 2 construction workers and a retired pastor testified to the make, model, and color of Mitch's automobile, while a 4th came forward to state he had written down the license plate number upon hearing the chaos coming from across the street. He could only testify to the plate number. He did not want to say for sure what kind of car it was or even the color, but he was more than sure of the number. After the prosecution felt confident they had established that Mitch and his car were at the bank that day, they went after the house. They could not prove that the 2 friends had been at Mary's the day she was kidnapped, but Luke was told there would be sufficient evidence that the pair had been at the house where the bodies were found and also at the house where Mary had been held. Neither Mitch nor Luke could figure out what the evidence could be since Mitch and Aaron had not been involved. It did not take long into this part of the trial for him to realize again he had been set up by someone much smarter than he. Fingerprints, hair, and even some of Mitch's clothes were found at the address where Mary was held. They had even produced tools that the prosecution claimed were used in making improvements to the room that Mary was held in. The tools were the only thing linking Aaron to the house. The only explanation for that fact? Aaron must have been more careful than Mitch. Later in the process, there were 2 lab techs. Each testified to the fact that blood was found in the car belonging to the defendant. To no one's surprise, the blood was found to be that of Ben Wilson. The next group of witnesses would talk about what they had found at the house where the bodies were found, the bodies of Aaron Walker and Mary Wilson. It was all coming together for the prosecution, the theory about his mind just before the events, the car, the witnesses on the street and in the bank, the evidence at the hostage house, and ending with the final murder scene. It was more of the same for Mitch, but he could tell it was having an effect on many of the jury members. He could not and didn't want to read too much into what he saw, but it wasn't working. Mitch thought the day was about to end early for the first time in the trial. A thin man with small glasses and a slight lisp had just finished telling the jury about what they had found and all the evidence at the house where the bodies were found. There were fingerprints everywhere, DNA in each of the bathrooms, on cigarette butts, and to top it all, the murder weapon. Yes, Mitch was hearing for the first time the gun that had killed Ben Wilson at the bank and also the two victims at the house had been wiped clean and found in a storage drain just a few hundred yards from the house. Luke took the opportunity to cross examine the witnesses and made sure to bring the point home that there was no physical evidence found at the house or anywhere else that proved Mitch was the one who had pulled the trigger at any point. Mitch appreciated the effort. In his mind, he thought this was going to be the last witness of the day. It did not make sense to start with anyone new with less than an hour left in the court day. There was only a small part of what made the next words he heard take his breath away. The prosecution calls Bridget Durant to the stand. There was a sudden energy in the room. Like Mitch, many had already started to replay the day's events in their minds. Others had started thinking about dinner, family commitments, or just getting out of that room. Only the people seated across the aisle knew what was going to happen. As people started to whisper and search the room for the next witness, Mitch did the same. His ex-wife was nowhere in the room. He was doing a second scan of each row when the back double doors opened wide, and the tall, beautiful woman he used to call his wife came walking up the aisle, accompanied by two of the young attorneys from the other side. A quick flash of jealousy came over him as he looked at the three pass by without any type of acknowledgement. Jealousy? Mitch could not figure out where that had come from. But if he were in the outside looking in, he would have to say that was one pathetic sap. His attention was back in full. He could not take his eyes off this person he used to know. His senses had become heightened somehow. He could almost taste the betrayal in the room. Would you state your name in relation to the defendant for the court, please? That was the first, last, and only truthful answer Bridget would give during her time on the stands. From then on, she would describe an individual and a life he had never known or would ever want to be part of. She described to the court how Mitch had slowly over time become more than just a social drinker, how he'd go out of his way to look for a reason to have a drink, even if it meant starting a fight, just so he could go out in the garage where he kept his stash. She explained how she just wanted things to be better, and how she knew if she could just start a family together, everything would be fine. Through tears, she expressed how she was just so confident in her marriage and in Mitch that she just knew they would have made great parents. But, she told the jury, Mitch would not discuss having a family, and he would not stop the drinking. He would not talk about therapy or counseling. So she did what she thought a good wife should do. She supported her husband the best way she could, by trying to minimize his stress and by hiding his flaw from his friends and coworkers. She described how Mitch had become distant, always off in his own little world when he was home, how things around the house that had always been kept up in the past stopped getting done. In her words, Mitch had changed slowly over time, right in front of her. Bridget was good, though. She never let the jury or the courtroom full of people forget how much she loved her man and how she supported him through rough times. If she said it once, she said it 20 times. It was a point Mitch thought was unfortunately rang true with several of the female jurors. They looked at him with a newfound disgrace. On day 2 of her testimony, she went into detail about how over the last several years she had noticed other changes in her husband. He had become envious of what others had. If someone in the neighborhood purchased a new car, Mitch would start talking about a new car. He had started wanting a boat, motorcycle, hot tub, lake house, and the list seemed to go on forever. There was nothing Luke could do during the stream of lies. They knew there was no point in objecting. Their best bet was to wait until cross-examination. It was painful to listen to someone you loved, trusted, and wanted to spend the rest of your days with turn you into a monster. Questions kept creeping into his mind. What could have done this to them and their lives together? What evil had taken over his wife? And would this bad dream ever end? After a 20-minute recess so the witness could compose herself, Bridget was back on the stand. She looked tired, beaten down by the whole process. If it was part of her act, she was carrying it off well. I know it will be difficult, but can you tell us about the night at the hotel? The night the defendant was captured with your help? Bridget had lowered her head, and she appeared shaken. Take your time, Miss Durant. The court knows how hard this must be for you. Mitch could not comprehend a situation that could be worse than this. not in his wildest dreams. He sat with his arms resting on the table and eyes focused on the actress before him. The jury listened to how Mitch had appeared at the house he and Bridget had shared a few nights before his arrest, how he had seemed distressed, desperate, wild, and not control of himself. Bridget explained that this is why she had promised to meet her husband a few nights later. She knew she should have told the police the truth from the start, but, after all, it was her husband, and she wanted to believe he was the man she had fallen in love with so many years before. Over and over again, she was still telling the court how she truly loved him, and how she desperately wanted him to be innocent. It was hard, though. Bridget began to cry. I mean, his whole story just didn't make any sense, no matter how much I wanted to believe him. The prosecution had taken the opportunity early on to share with the jury the statements Mitch had given the police and detectives. They did not want to give the defense the opportunity to bring this to the jury as fact. Rather, they chose to give it to the jury as make-believe, made up out of desperation. Mitch sensed that Bridget was becoming uncomfortable on the stand. She was still showing the jury what she and prosecution wanted them to see: the crying spells, the pauses for effect, and the protest of her love for her man. It was all still there. Something else he noticed, though. She had really started to fidget in her seat, and her right leg had began to bounce. She was nervous. For the first time, Mitch could tell she was nervous. It had been a long-standing joke about the correlation between her bouncing leg and her nerves. It was time for her to tell the room of her eager listeners about the confession, and that she did, unfortunately for Mitch, very convincingly. She did start off telling some truth for a change. She described the room she prepared for her husband, who had been through so much. Bridget even discussed their lovemaking and how she could have only prayed during this short time together they could prove his innocence. But that was all shattered. Her world came to an end as she lay with her head on his chest. As she lay there, feeling his chest rise up and down, he began to tell her of his idea to set them up financially, how he just wanted her to have everything she deserved, and it was just going to take this one time, and no one was going to get hurt. It just started to change somehow in my head, Bridget was quoting Mitch. I knew weeks before that day, I knew I could not leave any witnesses alive, or I wouldn't be able to get away easily, or even ever. It was not going to make any sense to risk everything for our future and then have to worry every day that there would be a witness alive. I did it for us and for our future. Bridget began her now predictable episode: the tears, the falling of her body, the shaking. She continued to tell her tale. He even tried to convince me he did it so that we could start a family I always wanted, and how I'd not have to work anymore or worry about the children's future. At first I thought it was a joke. Then I was in denial. And finally I realized I was laying in bed with a murderer, not my husband. At that point I started to fear for my life. I just did not know this man before me. She continued with how he tried to comfort her, and how he told her everything from how the idea came to him while he was at work one day to how he just couldn't let it go, all the way through the bank robbery to the final murders. She explained to the jury it was almost as if he wanted her to feel a part of the whole thing. Mitch was amazed. He had known the woman before him for so long, and how could he have not known what a wonderful actress she was? How many times over the years had she used this talent? He would never know, and that would haunt him as much as anything else. She pleaded with the jury, at times looking as if she was going to leap out of the chair and run their direction. You have to understand, I was torn between loyalty I had always felt for my husband and doing the right thing. I was just torn. Even after I made the call, I still thought about grabbing him and running out of the motel, and just running. I just had to sit on the bed and hug myself until the help arrived. I just didn't know what to do, she mumbled. The prosecuting attorney sensed his witness was starting to ramble on, so he stepped in and saved her. It's not your fault, Miss Durant. You never should have been put in that situation, ever. Mitch thought he saw a look between the two. Another shot of jealousy ran up his back. What was that all about? After everything that had happened and what she had just done to him in court, jealousy? Maybe he really was going crazy. As she stood to leave the jury box, Bridget looked towards the jury with an expression Mitch had never seen. It was a cross between a woman trying to keep it together and a woman who already lost everything. Man, she was good. And that concludes episode 9. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed, and I'm already looking forward to episode 10 next week. Have a great day.